All right, welcome everybody to our 7th webinar in the Fundamentals of Restorative Justice series, uh, hosted by the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. As you all know, my name is Aparna Polavarpu. I'm the Executive Director and Founder at SCRJI, as well as an Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. So I'm just going to remind you of the usual. You will see that you are able to chat with panelists only. Chat is being monitored by Torres, who is ensuring that our technology runs smoothly. Other attendees cannot see this chat, and panelists will not be reading the chat. So if you have questions, you must post them to the Q&A, which is that little Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, if you would like me to see it. South Carolina bar members seeking CLE credit, please keep an eye on the chat. You will be prompted every 15 minutes to submit your SC bar number. You must do this so that we can certify your continued presence in this webinar to the Commission on CLE. We have sign interpreting as per usual, and we also have live captioning. So to access the live captioning, please click on the closed captioning icon on your Zoom screen. So we've heard a lot in these past few weeks about accountability and agreements to repair harm. Our 3 speakers today, Brian Hilman, Lester Young, and Amy Barch, are here to talk about their anti-violence work, which can serve as an important and necessary companion to some of the restorative processes we've heard about. So that's why we've invited them here today, and we're really excited to hear about their work. And I'm going to start by asking each of you to briefly discuss your work and how it seeks to prevent future violence. And I'm going to start with you, Brian.
Sure, I'm so happy to dive right in, and thank you, Aparna, for the opportunity. And I'm just going to take the prerogative as a friend of yours for a while to thank you for your work in pulling together this series, but also wish you a happy birthday today. So everyone, we're thankful for Aparna for doing all the amazing work to make this webinar happen, but it's also her birthday. So that's an extra bonus. My name is Brian Heilman, and I am here today on behalf of Promundo. Promundo is a nonprofit organization originally founded over 20 years ago in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where my ancestors in the organization were working with groups of young men in very violent neighborhoods there to come together and see if they could define different ways of expressing a masculinity, a version of being a man in that setting where the prevailing options available to them were quite violent. In those 20 years, Promundo has expanded to have a global footprint, taken the curricula and methodologies originated in Brazil, brought them and contextually adapted them to dozens of countries around the world, and even to the point where now I'm sitting speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and where we're bringing those ideas that have been shaped in the global South to communities in the United States. Unfortunately, not in South Carolina at the moment. I know that's where we're mostly focused, but Promundo's programs at the moment are not actually happening in your communities there, but we do have pilot programs and things taking place here in DC, in New York, in Pittsburgh, and we're looking to expand more. But I think the role that I could really provide here today is more in setting a groundwork for also what Amy and what Lester will be able to go deeper on. And that is, taking a view toward preventing this violence before it ever happens. Like, what are things that we can be doing to even eliminate the kinds of cases and harms and things from even happening that we've been discussing so far in this webinar. And I think the framing of this session was meant to be like, what are the structures that are underpinning a lot of this violence? And probably the one that I can speak most directly to from my work, and that I know the other panelists will go deeper on, is patriarchy as a structural driver of violence. So what I wanted to do is, in my comments, which I'll try to keep pretty brief, sort of 3 main topics. The first will just be exactly that. What does patriarchy have to do with preventing violence? Then the second will be, I do want to give you a glimpse into how does Promundo's programs actually try to prevent violence using a kind of a patriarchy focus. So how do we actually do that? That will be the second focus. And then third, I really want to also compel us to look beyond just the individual causer of harm or the individual perpetrator of some form of violence, and look at how this works in kind of a structural and more even intergenerational view. So quickly, I'll take these one by one. Now, if I were walking into a classroom of young people myself to like start up the conversation about what is masculinity or whatever, there's a couple like go-to activities that are right there at hand. And if anyone watched the Feminist on Cell Block Y film that I know is kind of part of the suggested viewing, you even see Richie and his fellow facilitators doing these activities to start off the session. One of them that's pretty fun, especially for younger groups, is I will even like kind of step out of the room for a second and then step back in, pretending as if I have become like Martian Brian, like I'm a visitor from a different planet. And I heard that on this planet Earth, there are multiple gender identities. And like, can you please, participants, help me understand what are the difference? Like, how can I tell these different genders apart? And then the the students in the classroom will start saying like, oh well, women have this kind of body part, men are stronger, women do this, women are more emotional, and like a handful of like stereotypical things will come out. Some of them will be strictly like biological and sex based. Some will be more those social kind of prescriptions that placed on people, and then through that activity you can kind of start to tease out the difference between what's kind of inborn in someone versus the pressures and expectations put on them by society. But perhaps the even more common activity is called the man box. And I just wonder if anybody has heard of that before. And that's certainly what you heard Richie in the film working through. He was saying that the idea be a man is what led me to be in prison. And so what that means, the man box activity is when you hear the phrase, be a man up, what are the traits, what are the associations that come to mind for you when you hear that? And anybody can really generate those ideas. You saw it in the film, and I'm sure just in your mind right now, things are coming to mind. The stereotypical notions would be around toughness, around showing no emotions or any weakness, around a certain approach to sexual relationships, around doing certain kinds of work, but not doing other certain types of work, around being a financial provider, around being a protector. And the brilliant thing about this activity, which actually traces back to activists working in Oakland in the 1980s with men's groups, is that it starts to make very apparent how the overlapping expectations placed on men in order to like be a man in this stereotypical notion are actually pretty impossible. Or like Richie said in the film, men have to sacrifice their humanity in favor of like achieving some manhood. Like no human is able to never have any weakness, to never have any sadness, to never have any vulnerability. Look, we're living in a pandemic. What does that mean for like being a protector? How can an individual man like protect against a pandemic disease, let alone where we've done these activities in like active conflict zone? Living in economic recession at the same time, what does that mean? That okay, be a provider or else you've failed? Well, that's not up to an individual man to do. So when you start to tease apart these layers of expectations through one or another of these activities, it's really useful. And so it's also useful in terms of pointing toward the root causes of violence and therefore how to prevent them. So my role really in Promundo is not all that often to be the one in the classroom leading these sessions. I actually sit more on the research side. So I have a role of taking something like that man box activity and figuring out how to put it in a survey, like how to bring it to the entire population of young men in the United States and see what does it actually impact on their lives if they agree more strongly with some of those rigid ideas about masculinity or if they don't. And so like if you want a lot of like follow on reading material, I'm happy to provide it, and I'll make links in the chat when I'm finished. And actually I'm quite proud of our organization Promundo that like every curriculum, every study, every workshop, anything that we've ever made is available for free download on our website. So I'll put links when I'm finished. But for this study that came out a few years ago, it's actually called the Man Box. I had the task of taking those ideas I was listing before about toughness, about a certain hypersexual association with manhood, and then based on the extent to which young men age 18 to 30 in the United States said that they agreed with all those kind of rigid ideas, and we kind of like broke the men into different groups based on those who held the strongest, most rigid attitudes versus those who really rejected those most rigid ideas about manhood. And I don't know, what would you guess? I mean, actually, like, you as the participants in this webinar are getting a rare opportunity to see me present, but without just throwing a bunch of bar charts in front of you showing exactly like how all these different men uh, break out in terms of their answers related to rigid masculinity, masculine norms. But what we see so strongly is the group of the group of young men who were most likely to reject this rigid idea of manhood were least likely to have also reported using bullying behaviors, using sexual harassment or sexual violence, using violence against a partner, and even other things such as drug and alcohol use. And then the things that even put men's own lives and health at risk. So on the flip side, the men who held most strongly onto those really rigid attitudes and ideas were also more likely to have recent thoughts of suicide, to report depressive symptomology, even to report risky driving. So that's, like, in a nutshell, very quickly, getting your head around masculinity as a topic that drives patriarchy and really disentangling that in your mind from just like being a male person. Masculinity doesn't mean being a male person. It means the expectations and pressures put onto you that I've tried to make the case are kind of actually impossible and very harmful. And if we know that holding most strongly onto those ideas links with your likelihood of perpetrating all those forms of violence and other unhealthy behaviors, then there's obviously an opening there for prevention. If we can be speaking early and often and reinforcing those messages in a million ways, then possibly we can stop those behaviors before they even happen. And I know that that will continue to be what we talk about today. With just a few minutes left, then I know I told you there's a couple other topics I want to go to. How do we actually do this? So when Pramundo tries to bring those ideas into a classroom setting, I just want to give you kind of like 5 main takeaways or things that seem to make those sessions work better. And I just love that probably a lot of you have seen that Feminist on Cell Block Y video, because there's like a good view of what that can look like. Number one would be that it's actually really important to talk about gender and masculinity directly. We've found in research, I think, gender is kind of like, can be a buzzword that you don't really want to go there. You don't want to make it about that. The phrase toxic masculinity just like is this kind of what, like a lightning rod kind of thing in our society now, where it inspires actually a lot of defensiveness as much as understanding. And really at Promundo, we don't love using that term because I don't think folks have really had an opportunity to really understand it. That it doesn't mean that you, being a male person who identifies as male, it's not saying that you are therefore toxic. It's saying that, like, this whole stew of like use toughness against all odds, be like a conquesting kind of like approach to your sexual relationships, show no emotions, whatever, those things are toxic, not your being a man. So um, it, it's just so effective and powerful to help young people actually see those dynamics, see that man box, see the ways that it's not really serving them. The second is that you're moving people through a process of rethinking these ideas in a group, and in a group that matters to them, in a group of peers, in a group that they actually care about the opinion of the other people there, that they can, because social norms are social. These ideas come from trying to perform for your friends, trying to fit in with a group. And if the group is shifting, the comfort they have in talking about gender, the expectations and messages and jokes and things that they're talking about, um, then an individual is much more likely to track with that group than just on their own. So talk about gender, group setting, uh, actually directly talking about power and reframing power is effective. I think really the man box structure is meant to kind of offer some men power over certainly women and other gender groups, but also a lot of more disadvantaged men. And so if you start to have a conversation that's helping men find ways to feel powerful, but in ways that are power together, power within myself and self-confidence, power to do something because I have a certain set of skills, power that's more positive, that is a very exciting path. And then just a couple logistical things. This is not the kind of thing that you can just do in 5, 6 sessions, and then automatically you've created completely transformed mindsets among young men. It really needs like as many sessions as possible, and to be reinforced by what people are seeing in media, what they're hearing from their family, what they're seeing in other settings. So kind of to move away from just the quick, light boutique program. So that's 4, and then the 5th is really just the facilitator themselves. You saw how like compelling Richie and his teammates were in the film if you watched it, and that, like the facilitator having a really strong grasp of these topics and also being someone who can inspire trust in the participants. And I think in Amy and Lester we'll see like good examples of those. Um, I know my time is coming a little bit short, but having introduced the preventative power of like an anti-patriarchal view, and then giving you those 5 tips anyway for like some things that seem to improve when you're in a group setting, especially with young people. I think I really wanted to conclude by insisting that we think beyond just the individual. However, in this, like I think sometimes the masculinities analysis field and even researchers like myself who are writing all these reports about the men who have the worst attitudes are also the worst about all this stuff. And it sounds as if we're just saying, look at these handful of bad apple individual men. And then it's kind of easy to lose touch with how this all sits within power structures and systems of oppression. And so I wanted to just point our attention as well to the influence of just the structural and community and policy and family setting within which all of these things happen. And so just in terms of one's own home life, Pramundo also has a really big focus on fatherhood and the power that one's own parents, fathers, and upbringing had in shaping your expectations about gender, your proclivity to use violence yourself, or to approve of it, or to actually demonstrate more equal domestic work and care work in the home. It's not to say that everybody follows exactly what their father did, of course not, but there's like a powerful intergenerational transmission that happens there. And also the fatherhood thing has been so useful as an entryway, or like a if you think of young men, new father, like in the age of their 20s and 30s, they're actually like quite often pretty resistant to like getting together in a group and talking about like feminism and masculinity and stuff, but at the same time they're actually quite motivated to be good dads, and they're motivated to like have a relationship with their kids, with their partner, with their family that doesn't just look like the ATM, I'm the disciplinarian, I'm what that 1960s whatever nuclear family model of macho masculinity was. So suddenly through the lens of fatherhood, the guys have proven that they're willing to like explore new ways of manifesting their manhood and their fatherhood, and then you can even open up into more conversations. So I need to cut short there because I know that Amy and Lester will also then bring us to more of the view of how systems of racial injustice, of white supremacy, of incarceration, of economic marginalization also like bear the markings of masculinity and of this kind of patriarchal patterns. And those are also the structures that we need to understand that are driving some of this man box stuff above and beyond just individual guys making bad decisions. So I'd be happy to like I said, provide links to some documents related to all of the above. And I know I've gone really quickly, but when it comes time to have Q&A, let's go deeper on anything that actually seems really relevant to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian. Um, yeah, if you want to provide links in the chat, that would be great. I can also take them and post them uh, on the website later as well. So I'd actually now like to turn to Lester to talk about some of his work.
Uh, Peace and blessings to everyone. Again, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share just a little bit about my story, my hypermasculinity at 19, toxic masculinity, how these two things actually led me to serving life in prison, led me to taking the life of another human being. And it all wrapped up into this masculine, hyper masculine perception that There was no way to show weakness. Men don't show weakness. Men don't do certain things. You have to be strong. You have to be aggressive. You can't allow anyone to take advantage of you. And these were things that I would say that was shaped. It shaped in me at a young age. I would say around about 16 years old. I can recall these hyper masculine identifications or terms were given to me and sticked on me like a sticky board, just placed on me, saying this is what men do in the environment where I grew up. And I grew up in a fairly decent community, but the community was full of violence and drugs, you know, gang life. So that hyper masculinity was the norm for me, and that's what I saw to believe that how I as a man would express myself. As I said, that led me to taking another human being life. It was one weekend I was selling drugs, had a dispute with a person. And looking back at it now, I could have easily walked away from the situation, but because of the things that took place from 16 all the way to 19 that shaped this perception of strength and aggression, I chose not to walk away. And because of that, it was not about how I felt. It was about fearing the rejection of my homeboys, my peers, that this is not what men do, that you are a punk if you walk away and you allow this person to walk away doing this harm to you. So my decision was not based upon me, just like so many other young men that I work with today, help them identify. It's not that they make the decision for themselves. It's about the collective, that hyper masculinity perception that is projected to them, that this is how you respond to aggression. This is how you deal with transgression, is violently. And as I said, at 19, I ended up taking another human being life. And I remember sitting in prison. Again, this is another environment where, again, it was emphasized that this is the type of man I have to be in prison, in a violent environment where the alpha is the one that runs a prison. Your hyper masculine, how you project yourself, how you deal with violations, is the one that gain the respect. Those who choose to resolve conflict in a peaceful way, those were always the prey that was devoured by the wolves in prison. You know, and inside of a prison culture, it's hard for you to show that sensitive side, that side where you want to walk away from a conflict, you want to talk through a conflict, you just want to walk away. You don't want to be an angry person. You don't want to go and be the most violent person. You don't want to. Most people don't want to do that in prison, right? But I realized that it was just this environment and that stuff that was shaped in these individuals as myself to make us believe that this is what we have to do. And while I was in prison, I remember one of the prison chaplains gave me a book called The Wounded Boy. It was a story about a young boy who was sexually abused at a very young age, and because of his sexual abuse, he became very abusive towards his wife, and the sexual abuse that took place at his young age at 12, 13 years old led to an aggressive, hyper toxic masculinity. He just was an angry person. And he found himself physically beating his wife for a long period of time. And it took him to understand that this type of behavior was shaped from a trauma, from a pain. And because he was unable to express that he was sexually abused, because it was not the norm to say I was sexually abused, because that would make you appear to be weak in front of your peers. And he internalized that pain for so long that it led him to drugs, alcohol, abuse, and prison. So I remember reading this book late at night inside of my prison cell, and I remember crying. Like, I literally had to put the covers over my head, because going back again, in a prison environment, you don't want to show that side. But I could identify with everything that this book, the individual was talking about in this book, about how we live inside of a prison of this hyper false perception of masculinity, that it causes us to sit inside this place, inside of the prison, and we continue to carry this act out. And I remember got up that next day and I went and spoke to the chaplain about it. And me the chaplain, we talked about it, and he challenged me. He challenged me to identify 3 areas of my life that shaped that, like shaped my false perception of manhood. Like, what were those 3 things? And I remember it took me a while to think about it, but I finally came up with it. 3 things, what I call the external influence for me. One was music. The music that I listen to, the culture, where I come from, the hip hop culture, the music there, when I listen to it now, it's like hard for me to, I can't even listen to it really, because it's all I see now. That false perception of manhood, that hyper toxic masculinity is projected in every lyrics of the music. And I remember listening, and I told the chaplain, I said, the music was one that gave me that, to tell me that drugs, power, respect, womanizing is what men do. And the second was movies. It was the movies that I admired, the actors in these movies that I admired. They were always men that were aggressive because they got the respect from everyone else. They were the men that had multiple relationships with women, that saw women as only sex objects, not women that are people that should be respected. And then I saw that it was justifiable, or it was a cool thing to physically hit a woman. These are some of the movies that I remember watching. And the third I identified was the environment. That environment was made up of my peers in that environment, because all of us listen to the same music. We all listen to the same, watch the same movies. We all play the same video games. And in all of these three things, in all three of these things, it projected an image of hyper aggressive masculinity. And then I remember I was challenged with this. He was like, are you comfortable now teaching this? As you continue to unlearn these behaviors, are you comfortable now teaching it? And because I was already teaching in an imprisoned environment about my own, everything that I taught and I teach today is about my own personal experiences. Like, what did I go through to get where I'm at today? Like, when I think about like what led me to prison, it was that false perception of manhood, not willing to hear my homeboys call me a punk. I chose to pull the trigger to prove to them, and that's like crazy, right? That you would rather do something that will place you in prison for the rest of your life. That's how serious that false notion of manhood and masculinity can cause people to make decisions to harm others as well as put themselves in jeopardy. And I put myself in prison for life because I was afraid to hear someone tell me that was you a punk or you weak. So when I started identifying these areas, I then began to build trust. Over a course of time, I built trust with the men inside of the prisons where I visited, where I was housed. And the conversation would come about this whole thing about your man box. What do you have and what have you been taught about manhood, and what do you have in your box? And all of the individuals in these classes were talking about men represent power, respect, aggression, control, dictating how certain things are supposed to be. And the next thing I would ask them is like, where did you get this from? Where did you learn that men are dominant, men are controlling, men are aggressive, men are always this and that, right? And it came from that one thing, because majority of the men that I communicated with that time were Afro-American men from the age of about 17 to about 35 years old. And they came from that culture of the hip hop culture, the rap music, all of that was reinforced in that particular way of telling that this is how men act and how we behave and how we deal with women and how we deal with problems is always aggressive. No music that I've listened to, I mean, there's some positive stuff, but a lot of the music that I enjoyed listening to at that time was always about just disrespecting and telling you about killing, murdering, beating people up, and never anything positive about giving you a positive attribution of manhood. And like I said, the movies was that other one that I realized when I talked to the men there. I would call them and I asked them, like, to name that one movie that you love, like your number one go-to movie that you enjoyed. And at this time, I don't know if you all are familiar with Scarface. I don't know if you're familiar with the Scarface, Tony Montana, right? And because of this group, because most of the individuals in this group were people who were in prison for drugs that were influenced by a Tony Montana movie, and they saw how Tony projected manhood. And there was another one called New Jack City. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie. If you haven't watched it, look at it, because Nino was one of the main characters in this movie, Nino Brown. And he gained and Nino was a perfect example of hyper masculinity in the top form, right? Because he was one that showed power and gained respect by harming people. He never showed weakness. And when it came to women, he felt like, I am the man, you do what I say. So a lot of the men that were in my class, they identified, they loved Nino. They had shirts, they consider nickname themselves Nino Brown. But when you pull back Nino Brown was a typical individual that projected this false perception of manhood, and it shaped their perception of what men do. And then lastly, the environment, as I said, the gang culture that we come from, the culture, it's about, in order for you to be the leader of the culture, you have to be the individual that will be willing to inflict the most pain and do the most craziest, most outrageous thing to prove that you are the man. And that's a term that we would hear in our community, you the man. And you the man is not about sensitivity. It's not about showing your emotions, about holding your emotions and being the most aggressive person. So with that, I begin the classes around helping individuals as well as myself unlearn the behavior, like challenging them to pick out 5 men that are in their lives or that are not in their life that they admire. And I would tell them, like, because inside of the prison, it was hard because most of the men came from broken homes. They didn't have a positive father. I would say, well, if you have a relationship with a man inside of the prison, whether it's the chaplain or whomever, let's look at these individuals and find some characteristics you can begin to identify with and add that into your character. So the overall goal was to help them unlearn this by reading books like autobiographies about men who showed good character, how they were able to maintain love and affection with their families, men that cry in the dark. You know, some say that men cry in the dark. I would say find the book that shows men always crying, or get a book that talks about something really emotional so that you can be able to cry. For I was sentenced to life in prison. And to be honest with you, when I was sentenced by the judge to life in prison, I didn't cry. I did not shed a tear. Most people who are sentenced to life, saying that you're going to be sentenced to the Department of Correction at the age of 19 for life, most people will pass out and cry. But because I had my peers in the courtroom, I didn't want them to see that that was a sense of weakness for me. I chose not to cry. I chose not to cry on the fact that I killed someone over a drug dispute, that this family loved one will no longer be here because of that false perception of manhood for me, right? So I remember sitting there over a course of time, I started reading books that softened my heart and gave me a better perception of manhood. Then I remember sitting in class one day and I was teaching class and it was an emotional topic. And I remember fighting back the tears, not to cry because I was still working through my own problems of manhood. And I remember looking at the chaplain and he just said, let it go. And here I am standing before 300 men inside of a chaplain talking to them about the same topic. And I began to cry. And I continued to cry because I was crying not only as a 24-year-old male that was in prison for life, I was crying from the 16-year-old boy who never cried. I was crying because I never had the right to cry. I never had that passage to cry because of all of the false notions about men don't cry. And that harmed me. It affected my decisions. It affected my belief system. It affected my behavior. So now what I do in closing, I go through different communities. As I said, the community that I focus on is community that represent looks like me. It have the similar experiences as me because they listen to the music that I once listened to. They listen to different kinds of music, but it's the same thing. And I challenge them. Sometimes I print out the lyrics. I'd be like, yo, what is your favorite rap song? What is your favorite song? And they would tell me, and I would say, let's go print this song out. And I want you to go through this and highlight all of the bad things that it tells you about what men's supposed to do. And when they go through this list of songs that they love, they start seeing that these songs that they're repeating every day, that they're constantly quoting the lyrics to, it's telling them all of the wrong things about manhood. So how I help people unlearn is, as I said, I deal with the community that I can identify with and recognize some of their areas. I use the music, and then I challenge them, give me 3 video games that you love. And in these the characters in these video games, what are they aggressively doing? What are they doing? And you'll find most of the video games that our young people watch today, it's about, again, this hyper masculine identity where you gotta shoot, you're shooting people, you're very aggressive. And that, again, you're thinking about a young boy at 12 years old playing a video game that is all about blood, murder, stealing, and killing. And if he doesn't begin identifying that now, that he's going to be like me at 19 years old, sitting in the prison system, believing that killing someone makes you a man. So that's where I began helping our community, the young men that I work with, the Path of Redemption, unlearn this behavior by pulling out these things that they listen to every day, whether it's the music, the movies, and then I tell them to look in their environment. Most of these young people that I work with, they come from a gang culture environment where, again, we see this hyper masculine, this aggressive way of approaching manhood. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap it up there. If you all have any questions, I know I went over my time. I was planning on shooting for 12 minutes. But with that being said, I thank you all for this opportunity. Be blessed.
Thank you so much, Lester. And don't worry, we'll come back to you and Brian and Amy again after we hear from Amy, because I think there's quite a lot for some rich discussion here. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit about her work with Turning Leaf.
All right. So I am really excited to be here, and it is hard to follow Lester. You're so inspirational. You remind me of all the reasons that I got into this work. And I'm so lucky that you're here in South Carolina, so that we have a chance to work together as we expand our work upstate. So I started Turning Leaf, which is a nonprofit in Charleston, South Carolina, to work with men in and out of prison. Funny thing is, I actually never really meant to start the nonprofit. I was actually just volunteering in the jail. Moved to Charleston in 2010 and started volunteering. I'd already been volunteering in DC, Brian, actually, that's where I lived before I came to Charleston. And over the course of about a year, I started having judges start trying to sentence people to the class that I was teaching. And it was really shocking to me that, as a volunteer, judges were looking for alternative to prison, like so desperately. They were sentencing people to my class. I mean, I had a full-time job. I was just doing this a couple nights a week. Ultimately decided to quit my job and give it a go. And that was back in 2011. And so we have been grinding now for quite a few years and starting to find some success here. So I think Brian talked about the prevention and Lester talked about, the incarceration. And then here I am on the back end talking about what do we do with people that are coming out of prison, from a restorative justice kind of perspective. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that I started Turning Leaf, was because I wanted to do this work, but I couldn't find anybody doing it in a way that I wanted to do it. I was looking for an opportunity to work with people in real and meaningful ways. And I just couldn't find an organization out there that I felt like was doing that here. And so that kind of led me to start Turning Leaf. So today we work with people, men coming out of prison. Most of our people have violent charges. All of them have been incarcerated many times. All of them are motivated to look for a way out of a criminal lifestyle. That's what brings them to us. So Brian, you were talking a little bit about fatherhood, and that kind of gives you an in at that moment as a critical kind of juncture in someone's life to, as an opportunity. And I think that's where we are. People are coming out of prison, a little bit like Lester said, and they're looking for something different, and it gives us an in right at that moment to kind of, it's a unique opportunity for people to be open to the idea of looking at some beliefs that maybe not serve them well. And so we run a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy classes, which is just a fancy term for all the stuff we've already been talking about. You saw it in the video of the feminist help walk why. That's essentially what Richie was doing in that class, very similar to what we do. Also Brian in the man box. Brian and I were talking the other day, we actually teach a man box lesson. And really even what Lester was saying around this idea of helping people unlearn these beliefs and his own strategies of, having people pull out, music lyrics and having them read books, right? That's what we do in the classroom. We're pretty structured, where Lester is sort of fluid in his approaches. We run really structured cognitive behavioral intervention classes, but focused a lot on helping people recognize that thoughts and beliefs are leading to actions which are then leading to consequences that they're not happy with. And we focus a lot on the consequence piece, given where our guys are in their life. And they're saying, I'm not happy with the consequences that I've been given. And so what that turns into is them saying, yeah, I need to change some of my thoughts and beliefs. And so that's kind of our end, to help people start modifying. We don't necessarily ask people to throw it all out, right? We just say, what are some minor modifications you can make to some of your beliefs to get the outcomes that you want in life for you and your family. We also focus a lot on emotion regulation skills. So Brian, I'm not sure if you do this, but we have feeling face sheets. You probably have feeling face sheets, and we give our feeling face sheets to our guys. And it's, you guys have all probably seen them. They've got all the little faces on there with the different expressions. And we ask them to identify the ones that they have been familiar with. And a lot of our guys will only be able to recognize happy, sad, and angry. when they first come into the class. And our sheets have like 25 faces on them, and they will essentially be able to identify 3. And so we do a lot of work around, one of my students came in the other day and I said, how was your class today? And he said, it was awesome. And I said, what'd you guys talk about? And he said, understanding the feelings of other people. I really had a hard time with that, you know? And so it's really cool. And the other thing I would say a little bit what Brian was talking about, like, you can't just do it one time. You have to do it a lot. So our guys do 150 hours of structured classes over the course of 4 months. That's pretty intense. We're lucky that we have a program, I designed a program, right, that allowed for that level of sort of support and helping people change pretty ingrained belief systems like Lester was talking about. We pay our men for their time in classes. Our guys all get a stipend for participating in classes. We don't just pretend it's like this thing off to the side that they're going to come to class. No, that's important. We're paying you for your time to participate in these classes. It's really the foundation of the organization. So that's one of the first things we do. The second thing we do is individual level counseling. This is a lot of individual work on the same concepts that we present in our group classes, but then we're just focusing in on an individual level. So at this point, we're both helping people practice the skills that are most meaningful for them, but also helping them identify other kinds of barriers to success, the common reentry ones you hear around housing, identification, transportation. But it's also trust building, and I'm sure Lester can understand this piece too. Like, there's a lot of like trust building that has to happen. Like, everything we do is relationship based, and so the guys have to know that we're there for them, that we care about them, that we're willing to help them out in any way we possibly can. That includes paying rent if we need to, getting them an Uber if they need it, or just listening to them and asking them how their day is going, how their family is, and just getting to know them. The third thing that we do is transitional employment. We run a t-shirt screen printing business. It's a social enterprise. All the men, so I have a staff, and then I also have students. All my students are also my employees. On day one, they become a W-2 employee. We have found that work is really important to our guys. Obviously, they need to work, but also it helps us identify together, right? Like, more as a team. We all wear the same uniforms. We're all in the print shop working. We're hitting deadlines together. And it gives them an opportunity to practice the skills that they're learning in the classroom outside of the classroom. Again, a little bit to what Brian was saying, like, they Promundo really targets the families, right? And it's like, we also are basically in their work environment, which is a huge amount of time that we spend every week is at work. And so we basically now have them in the classroom. We also are their social supports. We're also their employer and their teammates. And so people, when they think of turning leave, oftentimes think of us as a screen printer. They think we run a t-shirt screen printing business. You know, they don't think about us as actually being like a therapeutic program. The screen printing actually just supports the therapeutic work we do in the classroom, and it's a therapeutic environment in which to framework around everything else. It's not really a job, but that's our front. We front as a social enterprise. And then the last thing we do is job placement. And this, I think, also a little bit speaks to what Brian was saying at the end about the structures. Like, I don't think it's enough to just say like, oh, hey, individual, like, you have to show up and change, right? Like, that's, of course, like, we want people to, you know, have beliefs that support their own success and family success, and they can be, you know, healthy members of society. But I think it's also really important to say, we can't just put people through programs, ask people to change, give them a certificate and put a stamp on it and call it a day. Where's the actual opportunity for people to, you know, move forward, move past, you know, have success beyond where they're at. And so we don't send our guys out on interviews. Like, we don't do dress for success or resumes or anything like that. We broker their jobs for them. We broker jobs for them. So we have like a portfolio of companies that are willing to work with us because of the work that we do here with our men. And they come, they tour, they see the work we do, they know me, they know us. I leverage my relationship. And we get these guys jobs. And what we consider a good job for us is $7 an hour above minimum wage, permanent with benefits, steady work. And we usually try to do our best to give these guys choices. Here's your 2 job choices, go interview, meaning go meet them, see which job you want. And so we think it's important not to just give somebody a certificate and call it a day. And then to us, like, we have long-standing relationships with our men. So they come back in here all the time, and I have to shut my door and like put a sheet up so nobody bothers me sometimes. It's just like the constant the constant, all the guys coming back in, and it's fantastic. And so I do feel like it's a little bit of a family around here. So I'm going to stop there. I think I did hit my time.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. I have a couple of follow-up questions for some of y'all. So the first one's actually directed at Lester, because I think of the three of you, Lester, you're the only one who also works with girls and women as well. Is that right? Is that a different, I mean, I imagine that's a different conversation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, it's a different approach to it. But like I said, I go back again to those, my framework when I'm working with boys or girls is the framework of music, movies, videos, and your environment. What are those three things that you're receiving the most information from? And then that helps me out. But for the young ladies, it's a little different because they are not overwhelmed with too much of, when I talk about music, you have some music that projects to them a false notion of womanhood, right? And it's about helping them again identify that, but again pointing, saying, hey, who do you look up to? And some of these young girls, to be honest with you, their mothers are not really a good role. They don't have those positive examples. When you're talking about in some of these impoverished communities where mothers don't have that correct understanding of womanhood either, and they're looking at their mother and listening to the music and stuff like that, it just continues to add to it. So it's about helping them unpack that and begin to just find positive role models within the community outside of their household, unfortunately, to be able to identify and possibly seek out getting mentored by these women that they admire.
Sorry, this actually ties to one of the questions that came in from one of our participants. And she asks, some African-American young men say they were saved by hip hop.
Yeah.
Is it because hip hop has changed, or was making the music what helped them?
I think the hip hop has changed. When we look at when the inception of hip hop in the early, from the 70s all the way to 2020, the music has changed tremendously when it comes down to, when we're talking about this false notion of manhood, it is overwhelmingly negative now when it comes to that, versus in the earlier start of the beginning of it, the 70s and the 80s, it was a little different. But you have some of these artists, as hip hop artists, that are not getting the airtime that most of the other individuals are getting. So the positive artists from the hip hop are not really being displayed or listened to on a rotation, rather it's through the radio, internet, or so on and so forth. They don't get the big contracts to promote. So these are the ones that are now not even being seen, and all of the other individuals who are coming with this hyper masculine false notion of manhood, killing, beating, and womanizing, these are the ones that are getting the contract, and these are the ones that these young kids and even some of the adults are listening to, and this is where it constantly reinforced that way of thinking. So I do believe hip hop has changed, and unfortunately, I believe that when it comes down to radio, not networks, but producers that are giving these contracts to young men, 17 years old, 14 years old, and making this music, it's nothing. And these young kids are following them, and that's where the influences come from. They respect the rappers more than they respect their parents.
Well, and I think both, well, I know Brian mentioned, and you've talked about this as well, Lester, the sort of the importance, and I guess actually, all three of you talked about the importance of changing mindsets, right? And changing norms. In some cases, you're going to have families and communities that are perpetuating the harmful ideas that you're working against.
Agreed.
So I'm interested in hearing from all three of you about how you deal with that.
I would say for me, it's frustrating because it was over like this summer, I've been working with about 12 young boys, and it's like you spend all of this time helping them change that mindset of seeing things different when it comes to manhood, right? But then they walk out of the car, out of the space, and they walk into a car where the mother or the father, whomever that is picking them up, playing the same song that we just dissect and showed. So it's almost like what I said for the last 2 hours in this class, it was reinforced with the parent once they jump into the car. So my frustration for the whole summer was like, is like we're focusing on helping change the mindset of the children or the youth, but we really need to be thinking about how do we help the parents redefine their understanding of this, because the kids are only a reflection of what they see and hear from their parents. You talking about 12, 13-year-old kid who have, it's just, I believe that now my approach going forward is like figuring out how to work with parents to help them better understand their role. And it's the whole changing their framework, because if not, we're going to continue to pour into the children, but it's going to be washed right out when they go back into their family structure.
I love thinking about that example Lester shared, where maybe you just finished your class activity and then the participant goes out and they're back in the world, and you can kind of like walk through the day in their shoes and see all the different moments where like influences can come. And really, like, that's why the ideal program for like really shifting these norms is not just a classroom thing. You can see in Amy's organization just like how they're trying to be so multidimensional. um, the ideal would be that as you walk through the day, every single possible influence is all pointing in the same direction. You like encounter some more transformational messages in a classroom setting, then you walk out, you get picked up by your parents, and the parents are like engaging in deep conversation about it and reinforcing the same thing. Then you sit down to watch your favorite TV show, and the TV show has a storyline that's like not leaning on the same stereotypes as ever and the same discriminatory views. You go to, if you're a church going person, you go to church, and the sermon that you're hearing is also like reinforcing more equality. And you just like, as you walk through, you participate in sports, and your coach also is like not doubling down on this man up, the coach is also finding like different ways of positive encouragement, your work environment, your whatever it is. And it's hard to do that in the US, wherever we are, just like just the comprehensive level of training and outreach that would need to happen if we're going to go at every level of a whole society like that. And just there are, whether it's mass media, but just way above and beyond mass media, so many just like persistently racist, discriminatory, macho, masculinist, up to the highest levels of power, is like still entrenched. You're just like not dealing with people who are then being reinforced by the same messages everywhere they go. And that's the struggle of this work, but it's also just so important to keep that in mind. I don't know, Amy, if you had thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I already mentioned that's one of the reasons that we started the print shop. And for us, it's a little bit different because we're not working with youth, we're working with adults, and that's completely different. And so that's one of the reasons that we started the print shop, because employment is such a, for adults, that's where we spend most of our time. And that's who we spend most time around. So that's one of the reasons we did that. And we also started writing curriculum specifically around this. I thought it was interesting. We used to use curriculum designed by other people. And what we found was that there was a lot of missing gaps around these kinds of conversations. Like people oftentimes think about family as a protective factor for people coming out of prison. Their family is going to be a sense of support. But for many of our men, it's criminogenic, meaning like it's actually like a crime produced, it's a risk factor. It's a risk factor because they have family that are involved in criminal activity, or people have developed relationships that they expect will go on in the same ways always. So we have children, we have people that have children with women that expect the exact same relationship when a person gets out of prison. When someone's changing, relationships have to change. And so we actually started designing curriculum around these concepts because we weren't seeing it anywhere. Because you really have to be down in it to really start understanding these dynamics. So we started writing lessons around setting boundaries. So we teach 3 different ways to set boundaries here. So we started we role play all the time with them. So we're literally like practicing, helping people set boundaries and practice role playing them all the time. So I guess for us, we started the print shop so we get our hands more around it. And then on the other side, we started designing and writing more curriculum and practicing in the classroom, more skills around how to sort of navigate relationships that could be toxic.
Sorry, do y'all have any thoughts on, what type of, whether additional work being done with family or communities would be helpful, and if so, what types? I acknowledge this is a very big question.
All of the above. Is that a cop-out answer? I mean, Pramundo was involved in this is not related to song lyrics, but we did a media analysis of the top 25 most watched TV shows among young boys in the US for like what kind of gender roles were being, like even what gender identity held the lead role, what sexual diversity was on display, what characters with disabilities existed, just like what were the kind of characters, roles, storylines available. And even today, like it was predominantly male characters who were ever using like force. It was predominantly female characters who would show like care and empathy. And so, somehow even working with creators um, to change what kind of images are being presented. The family is obviously such an important one, and there are a lot of parent training programs that are looking more into gender roles and masculinity stuff and pushing toward sharing care work more equally. Someone I saw in the Q&A had even asked, what do we do to reach out to parents as main kind of influences in children's lives and members of the community? And I can also post a link to that person who asked the question and everyone. We just released this set of card decks, basically like conversation starters that you as a parent can use with your kids based on like age 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12. I think that was about as old as we got. And they're just meant to be sort of like open-ended, age appropriate, like developmental stage appropriate ways of like opening up conversations about honesty, about emotion, about like being a boy versus being a girl versus other gender identities. So I'll put a link, and having access to resources like that and just support. But even for parents, you need to think of the same thing. Like they would benefit from having a peer group within which to be reinforced and move through that process themselves. It just takes a lot more investment and like reorientation of priorities than what we currently have.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I think we all agree we need to invest a lot more in the community than is currently happening. I think that link would be definitely much appreciated. And if I understand you correctly, Brian, that's really for parents who are kind of on board, right? They're seeking to help make the change.
Yeah. Not only on board, but somehow it's like in Pramundo's like social media world where like they encounter this thing. So who knows how many people it's getting to. But I just put the link in the chat, and if you all can help circulate and let us know which prompts seem like they're really effective and which kind of land with a thud with your kids.
And Lester or Amy, did you want to add anything on that?
It's a lot of work, and like you said, a lot of the communities that we know that needs the help, they lack it. They lack the funds and the education. So you find a lot of communities, the money are going not into these communities, but are going around the communities. When we're talking about addressing the violence and criminality and incarceration, we have to be thinking about these communities that are being deprived of the finances, the monies that will help create these structured programs to help them better understand. We cannot just like focus on the behavior of the youth without trying to help family members understand that they're reinforcing this way of thinking. When you tell your son at 6 years, 7 years old, be a man, don't cry, how you reinforcing this. So it has to be a lot of unlearning for parents to reinforce this way of thinking to help young boys grow up into being healthy young boys. But it starts with finance. You're talking about families who are making $8, $9 an hour, working 12 hours. They don't have time to come home and begin an educational piece. They're too tired. So we have to think about how do we save or protect the whole community. And it starts with creating better opportunities financially. in these communities. And it starts with creating these programs like this. And it's going to take some time because it's generationally ingrained in many people's conscience that they don't see nothing wrong with it until their loved one is in prison or cause someone in to die. You know, it's a lot of stuff with that. So I'll leave it there.
All right, I'm going to read a question from the audience. Can you share in more detail how you talk with the folks you work with about non-binary gender identity? And how do those conversations go, particularly with men who have deeply entrenched binary gender norms?
Probably I've been the one who's been trying, not to use binary language on this session, and I wish I had a really clear guidance for you, but primarily, and really like more and more mainstreaming of non-binary gender identity and just the wide range of sexual orientation and gender identity that folks will come into the room with really even pushes at the bounds of this historically kind of binary man box conversation. And I think that's almost like a good space for all of us in this call to think, how can we improve the way we talk about man box masculinity to not be reinforcing binary messages ourselves. The thing is that like what could maybe help is that, and I loved hearing Lester kind of explain this, the way the man box kind of carries its power for someone is sort of because of this binary identity, where like that narrow standard of like be a man is good, and you're kind of like pressured to strive for that, as impossible as it may be. But when you inevitably fall short, then what is the language? What are the labels? How do people insult you? Well, it's by like giving the labels of the other in the binary, you're a pussy, I'm sorry for, negative language here, but you can imagine that like the insults have to do with sexual identity or with sexual orientation. You can think of slurs related to sexual orientation that people might use. So like the binary is embedded in how the man box functions. And so if you can start to show the harms of man box in general, then, and your group is kind of coming along with you and seeing that in a new way, then it's also kind of incumbent upon us to take that extra step and say, and see, look how bogus it is that we're just thinking of everything only in this binary way. Like, what does this even mean for people who don't see themselves in either of these categories, or need to like just completely disentangle this binary good bad zero sum way of thinking about people's identities in not just men versus women, but in overall. But to be honest, in my practice, that's a little bit more hypothetical than something I can really concretely tell you how great it goes or how well we do it, unfortunately. It sounds like one of the group members has had better experience.
Yeah, it looks like at least some of our audience members have used the man box to teach about homophobia and transphobia. And I'm curious to know among the three of you, especially Amy and Lester, how much you do talk about sort of homophobia or transphobia, and also racism in your work.
We don't talk about homophobia directly. We talk much more about violence, right? That's really the square of where we're in. We talk a lot about the impact on the community, impact on their kids, impact on their family, impact on themselves, alternatives. And then we essentially, what Lester said earlier, we're trying to unlearn, right? The sort of scaffolding of the beliefs that have held up those kinds of behaviors. That's really primarily our focus. Now, in terms of the sort of structural racism piece, we don't, again, it's not like we have curriculum, right, that we're going in there to like talk about this, but it naturally comes up in our conversations, right? It's part of the dialogue of what happens in our groups. So it's not anything intentional. I mean, we expect it and it's healthy and we have conversations around it, but a lot for us comes back to, what do you want out of your life? Where is the end of the road that you want to end up at? How can we help you get there, right? And not trying to discount anything else, but at the same time, trying to help people stay focused on what they actually want to accomplish in the time that they have left. So that's kind of that's kind of where we usually land in our conversations, not trying to discount the fact that that's part of our lives and our society and part of what landed them in my classroom, but really trying to help them focus on what they want.
For me, rape being a black man in America, I mean, that's going to always be a conversation when I'm talking to others about this whole thing called race in this country and racism. But I don't use that to just continue to be a conversation, because I'm focused on helping myself heal and helping other men heal, especially in a correctional facility. And when we talk about healing, it's helping men be honest with themselves and being able to address some of the trauma that led to the incarceration, led to the anger. And I was just thinking about a conversation I had just a few months ago with a young man that I was working with a couple years ago in prison about who was sexually molested. And he lived with this for years, because in the community, you know, if you've been molested, you are a punk, you're homosexual, all of these bad terms. So this person lived with that for a long period of time, and it was always in a way of protecting it. And you protect that shame by being hyper aggressive about it. So it's like right now for me is like helping create that space of trust to help individuals who are living with these types of painful, traumatic experiences, to help them heal from that. You know, race could be, you know, we know racism exists in this country, but when we're talking about in a correctional facility where men who have been raped in prison, men who have been molested before prison, how do we help them break away from that shame that leads to anger, leads to suicide? How do we help them heal in that situation to go forward? It's easy to have a conversation about race because we know it's there. But when you're talking about something where you have been raped in prison, and now that has caused you to internalize that shame, and that shame turns into anger and aggression, that's an issue that I'm really focused on, and helping individuals process that so that they can be like Amy said, when they return home back into the community, they don't come with that scar that affects relationship, that they continue to bleed on these relationships that are trying to, these relationships that are helping them become better people. They destroy them because they're still internalizing that pain, which leads to aggression and pushing back from anyone that is offering assistance to them.
Do any of y'all conduct follow-up? Like, what kind of follow-up do you do?
We have somebody on staff who's formerly incarcerated, and he does most of our follow-up for us. So we do, well, a lot of my guys just come in, but he also does, like I said, we're close knit around here. So we just we have found that an aftercare program, a formal aftercare program never worked for us. People felt like they were like having to engage with us, and it kind of ended up eroding the relationship. And we found that we just treat it like a friend, right? We treat it like a family member. We check in with people. We call them up. We see how they're doing. We take them out to lunch. It's very informal. We help them with their taxes. We help them change a tire in their car. We help them find another job if they're not happy with the one that they have. So it's a very informal kind of relationship kind of aftercare model.
Yeah. I think that's my approach as well. My follow-up is monthly support groups, where we just get on a call and we just talk, just like a bunch of men or just brothers who have been in the struggle, just processing and debriefing what that feels like to be free, what life looks like after prison. And that's how I follow up. And if there's something major, a person would inbox me or call me, or someone else would say, hey man, we need to drive to Greenville, which we did a week ago, and say, hey, one of the brothers who was in our support group was going through something. Let's just drive to Greenville and go and sit down and talk to him. So that's how it's a very formal way of just supporting one another in their struggle and helping us process and most importantly, helping us heal. And by healing, we have to create this safe space of trust and accountability to help us heal. So that's how my follow-up has been, just on Zooms and FaceTime and stuff like that.
answer is a little bit of a cop out, Aparna, but and that's just because like I think as compared to Amy to Turning Leaf's model being like tied up with actually being like sentences to participate in the program, and just like we're very much in the nonprofit funding model where we get funding for, you know, like a year-long thing, and it's just like or these activities are only ever time limited, brief, too short, trying to be like come in as cheap as possible. And I think just under the whole webinar, the whole conversation of how do we shift our priorities, shift funding away from the the status quo system of criminal legal approaches to incarceration, whatever, and rethink what that can look like. There's a need for investment in this multidimensional, community-based, parent inclusive, media inclusive, music inclusive, school inclusive kinds of like preventative work that we're describing today that would also allow for consistent follow-up. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle at the moment. And after kind of like a graduation moment and like an outtake evaluation experience, it's like really, really rare that the kinds of donors that come to us would want to you know, contribute toward X months later or X years later, like going back and re-interviewing folks and seeing where they are.
That actually leads to a question I was going to save for later, but I'll ask now. If you, what kind of wish list of sort of like adjacent work would you wish to see, right? Do you want to see to help support what you do?
I mean, I can answer that one right off the bat because Lester and I were talking about it the other day. Like, we need more programs in prison. Holy cow. I started my work in jails, trying to get this started inside, and it was just, I mean, I give Lester all the credit in the world. It is just, it's a beast. And I think not only that, we need a culture shift. Lester, you and I didn't talk about this the other day, but it's like, it is not enough to just put a program. We need a culture shift in our prison system that, you know, also reinforces what's happening inside a classroom. But yeah, much more therapeutic environment in our prisons. It's just so expensive and so challenging. You literally have to start a business, like I did, have to start a business out here in order to have the time and space with people to really help them start building a foundation. But if you don't do any work with them before they get out, it's just incredibly difficult to catch something this far down the line. It would just be so much more effective, so much more impactful if we were doing more of Brian's work and more of Lester's work. And we should have many, many more therapeutic opportunities in our prison.
I fully, Amy, you said everything I was going to say. I fully agree with you. I'm a firm believer. I'm sitting here today on the outside of prison, was sentenced to prison at 19 years old to life. And I'm sitting here 6 years later with a full pardon, is because of the work that was put into my own personal development. And it was because it's just that I had a craving for books and education after sitting in prison and realizing what was going on. And here it is, I'm a violent offender, serving life, excluded from every program that was set in the prison system because of my sentence. And I was forced to educate myself and create programs to help others who are serving life as myself become better people. So I believe that more programs need to be inside of the prison system, but most importantly, I believe some of these programs need to be shaped and taught by men like myself who have went through the experience, who have had now the education and process things differently to now go back into the system. One of the things that broke my heart when I got out of prison is when I was told I couldn't go back into the prison to teach. You know, that to me was like painful, because I felt like my story, my message was so important for these men to receive. But they told me because of the condition of my parole, I was unable to go into the prison system until now I'm pardoned. So now I'm excited to go back into the system. But I believe that we need more programs, and we need to use men like myself, women who have had these successful experiences, to go back in with a curriculum that is focused on cognitive behavior and helping men and women heal inside of that environment.
Aparna and everyone, my response is just about prevention in general. And like my most direct experience, unfortunately, again, is not in South Carolina, so I don't know what like really the funding landscape statewide is like. But when I was doing this work in Minnesota, the state Office of Justice programs really mandated that folks working on domestic violence, working on sexual violence, like the funding sources to provide support services to survivors were like prohibited then from doing any work to prevent this violence before it happened. And just something is a little bit broken or just off when like we have resources coming to put people in jail and to prosecute, but not to stop the cases before they happen. When we have proven methodologies and we know what the root causes are and we have like promising ways to go about it. So it's like a culture shift, the same way that like thinking toward restorative rather than merely punitive is like a necessary kind of a culture shift. I think just preventative sort of like way of thinking about harm reduction as well will change the way you're thinking about funding, like in rather than, not even a rather than, we need like everything all at once, but why shouldn't it be part and parcel of grade school, high school health curriculum to have everybody think deeply about the harms of rigid gender stereotypes? If we know that they're as like strongly associated with all these harmful outcomes as they are, then why doesn't that go addressed? Like, why isn't that as important as algebra or hygiene or something? Like, I shouldn't make comparisons, but it is important. You can imagine like what like a fully like funded approach to preventative and gender norm transformative messages would be in a school setting, in a healthcare setting, in a community setting, with sports coaches, with pastors, with, you know, more and more card decks and like contextually appropriate ways to be advising parents. So just kind of embracing prevention.
So there's a question that I'm just going to go ahead and answer, which was, you know, is part of the problem with privatized prisons. And I'm just going to say that, sure, I think that's part of the problem, but also, you know, publicly, even in public prisons, it's a problem that the government has, and now I'm being kind of broad, but in different states and also federally, defunded programs for people who are incarcerated. So it's actually a problem across the board, the lack of programmings in prisons. I want to ask about your evaluations, you know, how you evaluate your work. And I'm also going to bring in a question from the audience here. How do you know that your work is effective to heal people?
In Promundo's case, we are able to kind of just ascertain the way that folks are, again, agreeing, disagreeing with a lot of those statements about rigid forms of masculinity in advance of working through a session with us, and then deep conversations with them afterward and kind of assessing across the same thing. And, you know, it's a little bit straightforward tick box, but we often see reductions in just like how closely people are holding on to those attitudes that we know are then linked with so many harmful behaviors. In the case where, I mean, I've mostly been speaking to our youth programs, but there is a lot of work working with couples in a context of like parent training, or just like working with men and women together on their gender roles, who's doing care work in the home, and so on. And in those cases, we can actually document reductions in both someone who had been experiencing violence in that relationship reporting that has decreased, someone who's in the past used various forms of violence in the home, ceasing doing that as a result of the training. In terms of heal someone's soul, Lester is here to talk to us about that, about what that looks and feels like. Yeah, but over to the others as well.
I can talk a little bit about ours. So we look at recidivism reduction as our primary program outcome. We look at rearrest. First of all, when you design a program, it should have a theoretical base. So it should be scientifically informed. And so our program is based on scientific evidence that shows that this kind of program model reduces recidivism. So CBT is a particularly studied and shown to be effective intervention for reducing recidivism, both for adults and juveniles. We also use a behavioral model here, which is a lot of the modeling, reinforcement, effective use of disapproval, incentives. All of those have been strategies that have been shown to promote behavior change. So we have like I said, an evidence-informed model. We're moving towards evaluation. You can't know until you fully evaluate. And then again, there's different levels of evaluation. A randomized control trial being the most rigorous, meaning that you have a control group and then you have your intervention group and then you study the outcomes of both. Those are very expensive. You have to have a pretty big data set. We're a small program, and so we're moving toward that. We just had what's called a process evaluation on the program, which is sort of the first step towards being evaluated, which basically looks at is the program being implemented as designed? So we have that evidence-informed program design, and then we had an evaluation that showed that we are implementing as designed, meaning that we are on average get the amount of CBT that we're saying, they get the amount of hours that we're saying, we're using the proper behavioral interventions. And so that's part of it. And then the other part of it is we just track rearrest rate. That's, again, it's very challenging to track that kind of data, but we do use public records to track our rearrest rates. We look at graduates. So again, that can skew your data, but that's who we have our hands around. And so our rearrest rate, meaning anybody who's been rearrested within 3 years of program graduation, our rearrest rate is 20%. The national rearrest rate is like 67%. Again, we won't know until we actually have an evaluation on the program, but we're doing our best along the way to set ourselves up to actually become a model that can be considered, effective and proven.
As for me, that's one component that I'm working to add into my organization now since being released from prison, is that when I was incarcerated and teaching the programs inside of the chapel in the dorms, we would measure it based upon, we would go to like some of the violent dorms, a high charge rate, meaning that these individuals have gotten numerous incidents inside of the prison when it comes to stabbing, violence, and we would go into these units and we would work there for a year with these individuals, and we would measure that based upon, have they reoffended inside of their system, have they taken some of these principles that we were talking about in that 1 year course, have they worked themselves out of what is called maximum security unit to minimum security unit, have they done these things differently, are they applying themselves differently inside of the prison, for has gotten their GED, have they gotten in trouble, have not gotten in trouble in a year. But since being home from prison and doing the program now, I'm working to add that component in how I measure the success rate after prison. I knew that was how we did it inside of the prison system, but now I'm looking at how to add that component inside of my program after prison through my support groups now.
Thank you. And I think one thing that we haven't said directly, but has been coming out of what everyone's saying as well, is that without this additional work, right, we're not getting any of this anti-violence support happening. It's not happening through the system of incarceration that we have right now. There's really no support. And unfortunately, we've got these these amazing programs, but they're individual programs and they're relying so heavily on funders. And what we need to see is quite a lot more of this happening and a lot more support for this at a much broader scale. So I want to ask one last question, and then I'll allow each of you to maybe share some closing thoughts. And this one asks whether any of your programs utilize volunteers from the community. I'm curious if this would help the ripple spread of the unlearning.
We don't use volunteers in any direct service capacity. So to the extent that we use volunteers, we'll use them sometimes for like ambassadors for our print shop, for people to help with digital marketing, videography. For direct service work, we've tried and have not had success there. One of the things that we've found is that being really consistent is really, really important for our guys. like showing up every day, being on time, modeling appropriately, responding to problematic behavior through the proper like modeling back. There's just such an important piece to consistency, and we had a hard time with volunteers around consistency, and we felt like it was like actually diminishing our approach. And so what we found was that when we moved to being more insular in that regard, and again, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but more like a family model, right? Where we're more insular, but we found that we were just more effective. We were able to kind of like, Brian, what you said earlier, like, it would be great if all people could say the same things, right? And that's really what we're doing. We all have shared language, shared messaging. We all know the skills that we teach. We all know the right time to reinforce them. If someone's late, we know what to say. And we found that it's much more of like a clinical model almost. And so we have found that it hasn't been effective. However, I do feel if you're thinking about like distilling the kind of work we do to a broader segment of the community, and you can teach sort of the basics of the kinds of skills that we teach here to people to take it out into their communities or take it into schools. Like, I do think that there's opportunities to kind of move the message outward, the ripple effect. We've just not found it to be effective here in like a direct service capacity.
Lester, I don't know if you had a response. I mean, no, Promundo wouldn't use volunteers in our work in the U.S. When I was a volunteer in a rape crisis center for several years, I guess my experience there just validates what Amy was sharing, that like you're quite often getting people who can commit for only like 4 or 5 months or one semester. They kind of do the volunteer thing as kind of a college credit thing, or like even the most dedicated volunteers would stay maybe a year, maximum 2 years, and then you just like struggling with the turnover and training folks and the lack of consistency and so on. And those organizations thrive by having volunteer labor, but I guess it's not, I guess like a surefire way to then have this ripple effect or have the kind of consistency. I had a kind of a concluding thought, but I don't know if we're going to that yet.
Yeah, I said it's to me is for what I do, not on the outside of the community. I use volunteers, but I'm really focused on, because I believe in the power of peer-to-peer support inside of the prison environment. And being that now I've been pardoned, I can go back into the prison system. I'm looking now to do more training other individuals around the curriculum or the framework. When I wrote the book called The 5 Stages of Incarceration, doing more training around that particular book so that we can have more men teach this particular curriculum. When I was in prison, me and a friend of mine, we created a program called the Outright Program, focusing on cognitive behavior, how to just that thinking process. And it was a pretty successful program inside of the prison system, where we trained individuals that go to different prisons for 2 years. They was in this program that we trained them how to implement this particular curriculum, and they would actually go throughout the prison and use this curriculum. It was successful, but then these individuals eventually maxed out, prison got locked down and stuff like that. So now I'm looking at one of the prison chaplains just started back at Kershaw, and I have the invitation to go back into the system. So I want to be focusing on training those that are incarcerated, as well as prison staff members who are interested in learning more about the framework around 5 stages of incarceration, so that they can, because they're engaging with these individuals on a daily basis and using them to be that one to share this information throughout the prison system. So that's going to be what I'm utilizing now, but on the outside, no.
Thank you. And I guess now I will offer time for concluding thoughts, and maybe we'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, like, only in case anyone has attended this session and thought like, hold on a sec, like we're talking only about men through this whole thing, and like a lot of the stuff about like the man box like being so bad for men. I mean, like it just like the point I wanted to like put in words so that it didn't get just presumed or lost is that it's not as if the men in the world are the like primary victims of patriarchy or of the man box or anything. I think we're like trying to paint a complex view where like the systems and the social norms and pressures that push guys to take on characteristics that wind up doing immense harm to women in their lives and children in their lives and non-binary folks around them and just other marginalized people in their lives. Like, men are not the primary victims of that, but this system is kind of harmful for just about everybody, including in terms of the emotional closed offness and mental health challenges and other things for men. So it's just like all the more reason, like primarily because of the harm that befalls women and others, but like also because it's just not really serving even men who think that it's serving them. That's why we really need to tear this thing down. So I just, in case that was getting lost or presumed or anything, but thanks so much for the attention. And like I said, make sure we share my email, and Promundo stuff is all available for free, and I'd love to answer any questions people have.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go before Lester since I know he's going to have some great words to say at the end. And I just want to thank everybody for listening, and Aparna for allowing me to be on the panel with Brian and Lester. It was an honor. And Lester, I'm looking forward to doing some work with you here in South Carolina. You can hit the inside and I can hit the outside.
Amy, surprisingly, I'm short. I'm done. You should have took my spot. I would just say thank you all for this opportunity, for me to be honest about my journey from incarceration to now being free, and just wanting, through my own personal healing, want to share this story to help other individuals heal, whether you're man or woman. It doesn't matter, because we all struggle with some form of brokenness that is preventing us from being our authentic self. So it's about how do we heal, and once we figure that out, we begin this process of healing, which will push us through so that we can continue to live our authentic self. So again, thank you, Amy, Brian. I thank you guys for this panel. Amy, I would definitely be reaching out to you because I need some curriculum assistance, but we'll talk about that offline. But you guys be blessed. Thanks.
Thank you all. And you, to all the participants, you can learn about all of these organizations. I think they've announced their websites, but I'll say it again. So it's Promundo, Path to Redemption, and Turning Leaf. And I'll, of course, post all of that on the website and then also on social media. So I encourage you to learn more about them. And next week is our last week. And I will see you then. Bye.